Good evening. On behalf of the Manhattan Institute, I am pleased to welcome you all for what I hope will be a great program. It is my distinct pleasure to be joined tonight by the Honorable Jason Kenney, Premier of Alberta and the head of Alberta's United Conservative Party. Even before the Premier was elected to his current post, he had enjoyed a long and distinguished career in government. First, as Member of Parliament for Calgary Southeast, which he represented for 9 years, then as an indispensable member of Stephen Harper's government, which he served as Minister of Multiculturalism, Immigration and Citizenship, then as Minister of Employment and Social Development, and finally as Minister of National Defence. In each of these challenging roles, Premier Kenney demonstrated character, a largeness of vision, and a fearsome work ethic. Premier Kenney's many successes in government have benefited, first and foremost, his fellow Albertans and Canadians. It was they who gained from a modernized immigration system, restrained government spending, a more modest tax burden. However, those of us who live elsewhere have also benefited from the Premier's tireless work. Across the English-speaking world, few Conservatives have done as much to adapt time-honored values to new realities as the Premier. Tonight, I look forward to drawing out those lessons and discussing the Premier's ambitious agenda for Alberta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reihan. I'm really deeply honored by this invitation. In fact, I feel like a bit of an imposter. I grew up as a kid reading Manhattan Institute studies and books and articles and City Journal, Charles Murray's Losing Ground, Myron Magnet's The Dream and the Nightmare, Gilder's Wealth and Poverty, and more recently have been a huge fan of Warren Cass and of Reihan himself. And let me congratulate the board of the Manhattan Institute for having had the wisdom of appointing Reihan as the director, one of the brightest policy minds, I think, in the Anglosphere, not just the United States. You're very fortunate to have him. And not only did I read all those books, I grew up as a bit of a Canadian lefty, and had a sort of intellectual and political conversion during my college years in, of all places, San Francisco. I went to San Francisco to become a conservative, figure that out. And my very first roommate, who was a young conservative, subscribed to the National Review, John, and when he, I used to mock and ridicule him for reading this terrible fascist magazine. But thankfully, I had enough intellectual curiosity that when he wasn't around, I started furtively glancing through the articles and terrified myself by finding I agreed with most of what I read. And so it was 15 years ago that I actually somehow got smuggled into a Manhattan Institute gala at the Pierre Hotel, I think, and I got to meet there for the one and only time of my life, the great late William F. Buckley Jr. So it was through his sort of intervention that I had a complete political reorientation, and that was through the Manhattan Institute. So it is a true honor to speak to this distinguished institute. I'm now the Premier of Alberta. Alberta, for those of you who don't know it, is sort of Canada's Texas, if you will. We are the beating heart of free enterprise values in the Canadian political culture. We are the heart of Canada's enormous energy industry. We are the home to the third largest recoverable oil and gas reserves on the face of the earth, which I think became a lot more valuable in the last 48 hours. Energy security was for a long time a sort of watchword of American geopolitical strategy, of military and foreign considerations. But I think in recent years, energy security became a sort of banal platitude that people forgot was a real strategic imperative. They've been reminded of that, though, in the last couple of days. And I just want to start by saying that I hope our friends here in the United States understand how fortunate you are to be bordering the third largest oil reserves in a safe and stable liberal democracy just north of the border. This is not something to take for granted. We have the recoverable reserves at current market prices worth something like $17 trillion. So in terms of proven and probable reserves, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and then Canada, followed by Russia and Qatar and Iran. Where would you prefer to get your energy from? The question answers itself, and so I'm here to remind Americans about that, because you now have a growing number of prominent political candidates who say they not only do they not want American energy production, but they don't want to import Canadian energy. So I guess they prefer Venezuelan imports, Saudi and OPEC imports, and we know where that will lead the world in terms of stability. But Reihan has asked me to talk about 4 things in particular, and I guess those are questions you're going to ask. So let me just say that we are leading a government focused on an ambitious, market-oriented reform agenda. Alberta has, in Canada's modern economic history, really been the engine of economic growth in the Canadian Federation, with the highest levels of GDP growth, per capita GDP, the highest standard of living. We've been a great magnet for migration across the country and a great engine of social mobility and progress. You know, one of the reasons that Canada has avoided some of the political consequences of deindustrialization that we've seen in the United States and parts of Europe is because of our strong and disproportionately large energy sector, which was a tremendous pathway to employment and incomes and fulfilling lifetime careers for people without a lot of academic or formal education who were able to move, for example, from Eastern Canada, for example, from the fishery in Newfoundland that was largely closed down because of the loss of the cod fishery. People, outport rural communities that were living in great despair, many of whose young men went from that despair and unemployment to the dignity of work and independence and self-reliance by working in the oil fields of Alberta. And people from central Canada and many people who in the Rust Belt states or Canada's industrial heartland of Ontario would have been otherwise facing perpetual unemployment ended up often with reliable 6-figure incomes in the energy fields of Western Canada. And through the wealth that they helped to develop, we were able to share that wealth through Canada's system of fiscal transfers, of equalization with the rest of the country. My province proudly has contributed over $600 billion of value to the rest of the Canadian Federation in the past 5 decades. More, that is to say, more that we've contributed through federal taxes than we've received back in benefits. So we have been a great engine of social progress and equity across the country. As a result, we've also been a magnet for migration across Canada and immigration from around the world. And broadly speaking, a very successful experience with immigration. Let me perhaps pivot to, well, actually, there's a couple more points about our reform agenda, then I'll pivot to immigration, because I know Reihan wants me to talk about my own experience as Canada's longest serving immigration minister. Now, in recent years, Alberta has seen the flight of tens of billions of dollars of capital. This started with the price downturn in oil in 2014-15, but it was accelerated by a series of devastating policies layered by both the former Social Democrat center-left government, which we just defeated 4 months ago, and by a federal government in Ottawa, led by Mr. Trudeau, that has been, I think, openly hostile to our energy industry. A series of policies that, well, killed, so we've had growing production of oil in Alberta, but not growing capacity to export it through pipelines and other means. So we've had this problem of being landlocked. Now, this is not a coincidence. 11 years ago here in New York City, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund hosted a conference with a consortium of green interest groups to develop what they called the tar sands campaign. The tar sands is a pejorative reference to our oil sands in which 95% of our recoverable oil reserves are found. They decided that they needed to block the development of this enormous hydrocarbon energy reserve. And this consortium developed a very detailed and bold strategy to landlock Canadian energy. these organizations, including the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Hewlett-Packard Foundation, San Francisco hedge fund billionaire Tom Steyer, and many others have poured tens of millions of dollars into the campaign to landlock Alberta energy in particular. While simultaneously, as you know, here in the United States, you doubled oil production and became a net exporter, and these same groups did precisely nothing to limit energy production or shipments from the OPEC dictatorships or from Vladimir Putin's Russia. How ironic, how deep, richly ironic is it that groups ostensibly from the political left have massively diminished the energy resources coming from a stable liberal democracy with the highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards of any of the top major energy producers on Earth. It makes no sense. I mean, the number one reserves, Venezuela. Number two, Saudi Arabia. Number three, Canada. Number four, Russia. Number five, Qatar, and go down the list. How could it be that these groups, notionally committed to progress and equity, would put a target on the back of the benign Boy Scout of geopolitics of Canada? It is perverse. It is a paradox. It is something that, however, that we will no longer tolerate. The reason I think they did it is because we are Canadians. We are polite. We are apologetic. How do you get a bunch of Canadians out of a swimming pool? You say, "Excuse me, would you Canadians please get out of the pool?" And they apologize as they leave. That's what these groups understood. They understood with enough pressure, they could actually affect our politics and the jurisprudence in Canada on energy infrastructure, on pipelines, on all of these issues. And so they managed to, in the last federal election, elect a series they targeted a number of districts, of constituencies, and a consortium of these groups managed to defeat pro-energy members of the federal parliament. They also elected a social democrat government in my province. And then there was this constellation of policies shutting down pipelines and imposing massive new regulatory costs and uncertainty. This is not why am I telling you this? Because this is not good for the United States. You know, we're now into the 9th year, I believe, since TransCanada Energy proposed the Keystone XL pipeline that would allow the shipment of nearly 1 million barrels per day of Alberta crude to refineries on the US Gulf Coast. Don't you think that would be helpful today and in the months of uncertainty to come? 9 years, but 6 of those years were taken up by a US administration that, to use a Canadian phrase, ragged the puck on presidential approval, which means endless delays on presidential approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. Then we got a US, President Trump approved the pipeline, only for it to be challenged by the same consortium of green interest groups, and have a federal court with an Obama judicial court appointee delay that. There's now been a second approval, but the clock has ticked and ticked away. And meanwhile, we now have a series of prospective presidential candidates who say that they will abrogate a presidential veto of that pipeline, creating a new round of uncertainty. So I am here to say that look, Canadians by a margin of 2-1 support the construction of that pipeline and another one we're trying to get built to our west coast. Americans overwhelmingly support the Keystone XL pipeline. We need to work together across party lines to build the energy infrastructure that will create energy security and reliability on a continental basis for generations to come. Because here's my view. I just been talking a lot today with people in this city about environmental and social governance, ESG. There are a number of major institutional investors in Europe and increasingly in the United States who are putting an X on the Canadian oil sands in my province because ostensibly of ESG principles. So here's my question for them. In a world where there is a consensus of growing global demand for oil and gas through at least the year 2040. In fact, I just came from the Eurasia Group telling me that the most bearish scenario is 20 years from now, 80 million barrels per day, coming down from 100 million today. So even the most bearish green scenario has virtually unaffected demand in global oil. In such a world, the question for all of us is what will be the sources for that energy? Do we really want to landlock Canada, a rights-respecting liberal and stable liberal democracy, so that OPEC and Russia can completely monopolize global energy markets? How is that good for the environment? How is that good for labor rights, for women's rights, for indigenous rights, for human rights generally? How is it that one institutional investor in the United Kingdom, major bank, said they're going to boycott Alberta's oil sands on the basis of ESG, while simultaneously being the largest bankroller of the Saudi energy industry? How is it that these same companies which are boycotting Canada are financing Vladimir Putin's Russian energy industry and gas fields in Iran? How could we have achieved this level of through the looking glass absurdity? Well, I think we did it in part because in Canada, both political and industry leadership didn't understand the highly coordinated and aggressive nature of this campaign. Like I said before, we Canadians are apologetic, and the energy industry in particular is managed by highly competent, brilliant engineers, geologists, and finance people who are linear thinkers and have been slow to understand this, I think, largely irrational political campaign. And so I'm here as part of our effort to respond with facts. So in addition to that, we are also trying to demonstrate how open we are for business in my province. We are reducing the business tax rate by 1/3 from 12 to 8 points over 2 years, which will give us the lowest combined corporate tax rate in North America, with the exception of 6 US states. So our combined corporate tax rate will be lower than 44 of the US states. It will be the next lowest in Canada will be 45 points higher, 45% higher. We are reducing the number of regulatory requirements, so the red tape burden in our economy, by at least 1/3. We're speeding up project approvals. We've brought balance back to labor legislation. And we also have some underlying massive advantages. We have the youngest population in Canada, one of the youngest in North America, the best educated population, the highest incidence of post-secondary degrees, I believe, of any subnational jurisdiction in North America, and a low cost of living, affordable power prices, and on top of all of that, we have a great standard of living. Calgary was just voted for the 3rd straight year as the most livable city in North America, according to The Economist. I will believe The Economist at least on this. And so we have, as I say, a great story to tell. Now, let me perhaps just quickly close by saying we also believe in the importance of attracting people with energy, with the same kind of entrepreneurial spirit that built our frontier province over a century ago. And one of my messages to all center-right parties and think tanks across the world is that parties of enterprise, parties that believe in markets, parties that believe in conservative values, should be the friends of smart immigration policy. Now, granted, countries that allow large-scale irregular or illegal migration inevitably undermine public support for legal migration, and I think also undermine the chances of successful integration. For 5 years, I led root and branch reforms of Canada's quite generous immigration system to ensure that newcomers are better connected to the labor market, to ensure that we were selecting people with a kind of relevant human capital to succeed and integrate successfully, while simultaneously cracking down on various forms of abuse of our generosity, irregular and illegal immigration, false asylum claims, human smuggling, human trafficking, citizenship fraud, and various other forms of fraud. Because, while I've quoted The Economist, I'm now going to quote Thomas Friedman, who said that a functioning immigration system should have a tall fence, he didn't say wall, but in order to have a broad gate. And that, for me, is the model of Canada's system. I could go on to critique how that's been changed under Mr. Trudeau's administration. But the point is this. Broadly speaking, we've had a successful story of integration and economic contribution by the energy of newcomers to Canada, and that's certainly part of our strategy to revitalize the economy of my home province. So I look forward to a good conversation with Reihan and from the crowd as well. I'm really happy to be here, and hopefully also to be challenged and informed in our policy reform agenda in Alberta. Please keep a close eye on us, and let me also extend to you an invitation to, if you've never been, to come and visit the most majestic mountains on earth in the Alberta Rockies. Come to Banff and Lake Louise. Come to the Calgary Stampede, the greatest outdoor show on earth. And if you have certain misconceptions about Canada politically, come and visit us in Alberta and see an energetic, and I hope successful, centre-right government revitalizing our home with market-oriented policies, the kind of policies that the Manhattan Institute has long been an advocate for. Thank you very much.
Premier Kenney, you mentioned Alberta's extraordinary prosperity and the opportunities that Alberta has created for so many working Canadians and migrants from overseas as well. One challenge, however, is that prosperity driven by hydrocarbon energy and much else has meant that Alberta's public spending has historically also been unusually high. Public sector workers in Alberta have shared in that bounty, perhaps to a degree that now, during what has been a difficult period economically for the province, has meant some need for rebalancing.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might share some thoughts on that.
You're bang on. So we just commissioned an expert report on our finances, and they confirmed that we have by far the most inefficient provincial government in Canada. We spend about 20% more per capita than the average amongst Canadian provinces to deliver essentially the same package of services, often with sub-average outcomes. Like we have longer surgical wait times in our state healthcare system. We have lower than average university completion in our post-secondary institutions, and so on. Now, not to say we're behind the curve on everything, but on many things. So that does not justify a huge cost premium in the delivery of public services. We are probably the most expensive subnational government in North America when it comes to delivery of services. Let me isolate healthcare as an example. Canada is, amongst all of the universal single-payer systems of the developed world, of the OECD, we are at the top of the cost curve. We're at about 10% GDP. Obviously, the United States is more expensive for reasons that you're all familiar with. Alberta is at the top of the Canadian cost curve. So I maintain that we may have the most expensive government-run health system in the developed world. And yet we have lower life expectancy and higher infant mortality than the average in Canada. So when I point this out to my fellow citizens, they agree with me. This is totally unacceptable. And so now we have to go through a period of fiscal reform, fiscal restraint, because we have the largest per capita deficit in Canada. The Social Democrat government, which we just replaced, had us on track for a massive increase in our debt servicing costs. So we're preparing a budget for this October, which will include some, I would say, prudent but necessary spending reductions overall. We are confident that because of the overspending, we can achieve that without significantly affecting the quality of frontline services. One of the reasons for the cost premium has been, as you suggest, a benefit and wage premium for many people in our public sector. We pay, on average, 20% more than the other provinces. That's half our budget, is public sector compensation. And so we are going to have to get a handle on that. It will not be easy, but it's absolutely necessary. And I was elected on a mandate, the largest mandate in my province's electoral history, to do this, and we are absolutely determined to do so.
You have played a role in unifying Canada's right on more than one occasion. At the federal level, the uniting of the Progressive Conservative Party and the Reform Movement, and at the provincial level, the Wild Rose Party and the Progressive Conservative Party. Now, a lot of those pathologies and dysfunctions you described of Alberta's public sector did not emerge under the previous New Democratic government, but rather it was decades in which you had ostensibly right-of-center folks in charge who were allowing this public sector to grow enormously. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on reconciling some of those factional divides on the right, because of course here in the United States, we also have our divides on the right too.
Yeah, so you're right. With Stephen Harper, I was very involved in reuniting a divided conservative movement in our federal politics to create the new Conservative Party of Canada, which provided, I think, 10 years of good government under Prime Minister Harper's leadership. And more recently, I went through a similar process in Alberta. The really interesting question is, why did we have these divisions in the first place? Because, I would say that my observation is you have a similar division in the Republican Party. I mean, it still notionally coheres, but there is, clearly a huge and growing tension, at least, if not divide, within organized conservative politics here. We can see that in the United Kingdom with the Brexit Party and before it UKIP. In Canada, I would say those. So what happened was, in both instances, what started those breakups. In the case of the rise of the Federal Reform Party in the late 1980s, early 90s, this was largely the conservative base that became very frustrated with Brian Mulroney's progressive conservative government for really forgetting about their core commitments on things like balancing the budget and a whole range of issues. Basically, they arguably went out of their way to offend their electoral base. And my view in politics is you can only do that for so long before your voters take the hint. In that case, they took the hint and they left. They started their own sort of populist center-right party. It was never kind of a crazy demagogic populism. Very same thing happened in Alberta. So I think these are cautionary tales for leaders of center-right parties never to take their own voters for granted. And it's a reminder at the same time for leaders to remember the importance of being broad-minded. It's not easy to maintain the coherence of a Big Tent coalition. In Canada, in a first-past-the-post Westminster system, we cannot afford, as conservatives or free market-oriented people, to be divided. To win at the federal level, you need at least 40% of the vote in our system. If you're divided, you have no chance of winning. So ultimately, it was that. It was the experience of losing which caused activists to realize that they had to stop the internecine conflict and reunite. But it also took strong leadership. And I can tell you now, in my province, the Unity project has been hugely successful, and at the national level. Unfortunately, one of my former cabinet colleagues, Maxime Bernier, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, lost the leadership race for the Conservative Party of Canada to Andrew Scheer, who's now running against Justin Trudeau. Maxime ultimately, he lost the Canadian equivalent of a presidential primary, and rather than gracefully accepting that, he's decided to go out and start his own sort of libertarian fringe party, which is polling at sort of 2%. But that 2% could be enough to defeat Conservative candidates in enough ridings to keep Mr. Trudeau in office, which I think would be a catastrophe for the Conservative Party.
You discussed energy during your remarks, and one issue that is not very well understood by many observers in the United States is that though you have opposed the Canadian federal government's push for rigid carbon pricing, you have in fact offered an environmental strategy of your own. And when you're looking at the oil sands, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there have actually been pretty impressive environmental strides made by the Albertan oil industry. So tell us a bit more about your alternatives.
That's something people don't know about, but huge investments in science and technology have helped us to reduce the carbon intensity of the average barrel of Alberta heavy crude, which primarily comes from bitumen oil sands, by 30% in the last 20 years. And we're on track to reduce it by another 20% in the next 10 years. So a huge reduction in carbon intensity. I'll give you one example. Last week I was at an announcement of a $1.4 billion new natural gas-fueled cogeneration operation in the oil sands that will replace two 40-year-old petcoke crackers to produce steam that's used in the extraction and the processing of the oil. This one innovation, which is based on very recent technology, will reduce the carbon output of that company, Suncor, by 25%. It will reduce NOx, SOx, and particulate dramatically. It will reduce water usage in oil sands development by 20%. It will also create a domestic market for much of our stranded natural gas. That's just one example of thousands of technological advances. There are trials right now to use solvents to replace steam, to extract the oil from the sand. That would radically reduce energy use and therefore carbon intensity. We are now, our oil sands is now below the global average for heavy crude in terms of its carbon intensity. And so again, these banks and others who are putting a strike on our oil sands while financing Nigerian heavy crude, not to mention California. You know, we have Leonardo DiCaprio and Jane Fonda and Neil Young flying up to the oil sands in their private airplanes to protest what we do when, I mean, I know Jane Fonda in particular, her house in Beverly Hills is right on top the Los Angeles oil reservoir, which has a higher carbon footprint than what we do in northern Alberta. So I suggested to her that she should just have a protest on her own front yard, rather than flying all the way up to Alberta. So there are enormous myths about carbon intensity, and as I say, we're on the cusp of some other technologies which we will be supporting. Our government, a pro-oil and gas government, will be imposing a carbon levy on major industrial emitters. That will be a smart levy if they are below the average carbon intensity in their industry sector. They'll pay a lower price. If they're above the average, they'll pay a higher price. It's an incentive for reducing carbon output. And the revenues will go into a technology fund to support further reductions in carbon emissions. This is the kind of practical solution that we need. One last point. We also have vast reserves of natural gas, which are kind of stranded right now. We think the single biggest thing that we could do to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions would be to export more Canadian liquefied natural gas to Asian markets to help them convert from coal-fired power production to much lower carbon natural gas. But unfortunately, kind of like your Senator Warren, we have politicians on the center left in Canada who do not seem to look at carbon and GHG issues globally, but rather they're only scoring Canada domestically while we're leaking carbon and capital and jobs to other jurisdictions with lower environmental standards. We want to be part of the global solution. Increasingly, we will be.
You mentioned how much Alberta has contributed through fiscal equalization to the Canadian Federation writ large, and you celebrated that. How much your development has been shared, the fruits of your development have been shared. However, there's also an undercurrent in which if the federal government is not really properly respecting Alberta's economic interests, the well-being of Alberta's workers, there's always the question of whether or not Alberta ought to enjoy more autonomy and what are the circumstances that might trigger your provincial government to take further steps in that direction.
Well, we were elected on a mandate to push for more autonomy in a number of areas, but let me just say, if Mr. Trudeau's government is reelected next month and refuses to reverse some of the policies that have been inflicted massive damage on our economy, then we will be advancing a more assertive agenda within the Canadian Federation. Long story short, Alberta has really paid disproportionate share of the, as I told you, we've been the massive net contributor to the rest of the country. We've, in many ways, paid the bills. And all we ask for is the right and the ability to develop, ship, and sell the resources that pay the bills in our federation. If we don't get that, then we are going to have to be much more assertive. And I'm not going to get into the details right now because I don't want to distract from the federal election that's going on in Canada. But look, let me put it this way. We've had recent polls with as much as 50% of my population saying that they would entertain separating from the Canadian Federation. And now, not all of those people mean it, and in some cases, those polls, I think, are a way of people to just kind of express deep dissatisfaction. But there is something real at the heart of that, which, as a Canadian federalist, troubles me. I will always be a Canadian patriot, but we need to see respect for the workers, the region, and the industry that have been the key engine of our growth. And if not, it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
I'll forgive you for not answering this question too bluntly, but I wonder, one question is the federal government in Ottawa. Another question is the government in British Columbia, which seems incredibly resistant to, for example, the creation of a pipeline that would give Alberta access to global energy markets. So I'm curious as to how you see the balance there. Well, just particularly, how much of this is provincial resistance from BC, and how much of this is?
It's all of the above. We also have the government of Quebec saying they won't allow a pipeline to the East Coast. Listen, this is so bizarre. Canada, as I said, third largest oil reserves on Earth, and yet Eastern Canada is fueled in part by Saudi oil imports, because we don't even have the infrastructure to ship our Canadian energy to fuel the Eastern Canadian economy. Much of the Central Canadian economy, Ontario and Quebec in particular, fueled by energy imports. Now, you Americans are benefiting from that because of the shale revolution here. With your becoming a net exporter, you're selling a lot of American oil at the full WTI price to Central and Eastern Canada, as well as Saudi, North Sea, Nigerian, Algerian crude. And meanwhile, we are massively underselling Canadian crude to the United States because we're price takers. This makes absolutely no sense. So we've had provincial governments in Quebec and British Columbia trying to block these projects. We've made it clear that if they start a trade war, we will end it, and we have a number of levers that we're prepared to use if necessary. So, for example, we have said that if the British Columbia government takes actual steps to block the completion of a planned pipeline to the West Coast, that we will stop Alberta oil shipments to British Columbia, which would triple or quadruple gas prices in the Lower Mainland, in the Vancouver area. We don't want to start with that, but we'll have to end there if they actually try to violate the law by blocking our energy exports. I hope it doesn't come to that. And to his credit, my British Columbia counterpart, who is from a Social Democrat Party, is in favor of liquefied natural gas exports off the West Coast, and we can work together on issues like that.
When you look to the Canadian Alliance, the Reform Movement, the Progressive Conservative Party, these were all parties that were known for appealing chiefly to old stock Canadians, shall we say. When we look at the Unified Conservative Party of Canada, in which you were an essential member, this was a party that had an enormously diverse support base, and many would attribute this almost entirely to you and your efforts. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that. How is it that you began that work of outreach to new arrivals to Canada, to second-generation Canadians, to various ethnic minority communities?
Well, back in the early mid-90s, I was head of something called the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And I remember I went down to Vancouver and I did a Cantonese language radio show. The host was translating me into Cantonese and the callers into English. And I had never heard more anger about high taxes and government waste from any constituency more than the Cantonese callers into that radio show. And something clicked for me. I suddenly thought, I should be spending a lot more talking to these folks. And I started to do that very deliberately. And the more I did so, then that was the East Asian community, then the South Asian community, and then the Filipino community, and then, of course, the Eastern European communities. And more deeply I went into these different, what we call in Canada, cultural communities, ethnic communities, the more I realized that broadly speaking, they were on most issues sort of to the right of the norm, of the mean, by far to the right of the mean in Canada. And yet many of the voters in these communities had been for a couple of generations, for decades, core parts of the liberal electoral base in Canada. I thought, how could this be? These are small C Conservatives that are voting for a large L Liberal Party that is not consistent with their interests. I'll never forget meeting with leaders of the Korean community in Vancouver. And there was a guy sitting to my right who was a Korean evangelical pastor, but he was president of something called the Korean NDP, that's the Social Democratic Party, the New Democratic Party, the Korean NDP Small Businessmen's Association. And I said, this is like the Association of Chickens for Colonel Sanders. The Turkeys for Thanksgiving coalition. It made no sense to me. This guy couldn't have been aligned with the NDP on anything, cultural, social, or economic. I mean, the Koreans are overwhelmingly anti-communist because these are people who came from the Korean Peninsula. And on everything, national security, human rights, economic policy, fiscal policy, cultural issues, aligned with the Conservatives. And I said, how could that be? He said, when we came to Vancouver in 1972, we moved to where there was affordable housing, which happened to be the suburb called Burnaby. Our first MP was a member of the NDP. He came to our first community events. He helped us to get zoning from the city council to build our first church. He brought greetings at our first Chuseok and Korean Lunar New Year. He helped us with our immigration case files when we were dealing with the national government. And it suddenly, this was my eureka moment, I suddenly realized that in that case, 40 years of voting had been determined by a relationship. This is why the representatives of Tammany Hall went down to the boats in the 1850s as they were unloading passengers from Ireland here in Manhattan to welcome them and to help them find their first shelter, their first job, and to hardwire them in to the Democratic Party machine of New York City. The importance of relationships became evident to me. And we as Conservatives had never bothered trying to build those relationships. So people heard all sorts of grotesque misconceptions and stereotypes about the Conservative parties in Canada, which did not, that we were xenophobic and anti-immigrant and hostile to their interests, none of which was true. And if people won't even tune you into your frequency, they won't hear your message on crime, the economy, taxes, foreign policy, whatever it might be. And so I went to Stephen Harper when we were creating the new Conservative Party of Canada, and I said, I've got this theory that the only way we will be a majority coalition in Canadian politics again, given the changing demography and the relatively high levels of immigration, is if we become the party of new Canadians who are natural, by and large, natural conservatives. And he said, well, long story short, he said, well, I'm skeptical, but go and prove me wrong. And so I got sort of license from him and some resources to go out in a very intensive campaign that ended up taking 15 years. Long story short, in the 2011 Canadian federal election, we ended up winning a higher share of vote amongst first-generation immigrants than we did amongst the native-born population. And I believe to this day we're the only center-right party in the developed world, perhaps in the post-war period, to have done so. And I must tell you, when I watch the performance of the Republican Party on this, it just blows my mind. I mean, the fact that 80% of East Asian of Americans of East Asian origin are voting for the Democrat Party, given how I intuitively know their political values align, it makes no sense to me. So, but I'm glad to see the British Conservative Party. In my own cabinet, this stuff doesn't happen by accident. Like, you have to make a constant effort to reach out. But the natural alignment of values is there. My own cabinet, I have a remarkably strong Minister of Social Services who is a young, brilliant engineer of Punjabi Indian origin. I have my Minister of Infrastructure is a brilliant Maharashtri Indian immigrant to Canada, brilliant engineer. My Minister of Culture is of Telugu origin. My Minister of Municipal Affairs, a brilliant lawyer who immigrated from Nigeria, grew up on a poor subsistence farm. My Minister of Seniors is a Hong Kong immigrant. My Minister of Mental Health and Addictions is a mainland Chinese immigrant. All of them elected and appointed to cabinet on their merit, but all of them in a way reflecting the diversity of our coalition, which was the result of constantly reaching out. Sorry for the long answer.
Not at all, not at all. Do we have any questions from the audience?
You're the moderator, right?
Yes.
I'm confused about something. I heard that.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
I heard that the land itself belongs to the government, belongs to Canada. So while corporations can drill there, for instance, or do whatever business they're doing with the land, the resources, etc., the value belongs to the Canadians.
Correct.
Would you please translate that into the social services? How does it go from the corporations, and because Canada owns the land, it doesn't get transferred to the corporations, they somehow are able to transfer this into services?
Well, on the first part, all natural resources, mineral resources that are subterranean belong to the Crown, the state. And then we lease the right to develop those resources out to private companies. And on that, we don't have any state-owned energy companies. We have, the sole exception of the United States, the most open marketplace for development of natural resources. But ultimately, the resource belongs to the state. We take a royalty from the. First of all, they pay lease payments to the Crown for that land if it's Crown land. And then if they develop the mineral resources, they pay royalties to the state, which is an important stream of revenue for us. But I don't understand that. How does that apply to social services?
Well, obviously, the money comes from somewhere.
Yeah. So, no, it helps to fund our social services for sure. And these companies also pay corporate taxes, and their workers pay personal income tax, and it's a major driver of wealth. And that's one of the reasons we ended up with the most expensive subnational government in North America, is because we had this tremendous source of revenue from hydrocarbons. But in the last 5 years, we've been in a period of, frankly, decline and stagnation in that industry, and hence a fiscal crisis. Did I?
Oh, that's terrific.
I very much enjoyed your presentation. I'm very interested in your description of the composition of your cabinet, your new cabinet, which you describe as being ethnically extremely diverse. What is your policy and Canadian policy? You've had many years of experience with immigration, both in the national and in the provincial governments, right? What is Canadian policy on assimilation, that is, becoming a Canadian, as opposed to, in the States, we have an issue with identity politics, which seems to tell ethnic groups, well, assimilation is no longer important. You can maintain your old world culture, your old world values, and so on. And so how would you describe the Canadian policy on assimilating all of these new immigrant groups that you're dealing with?
I would describe how would I describe the policy? Well, Canada adopted an official policy of multiculturalism in our Constitution in 1982, which was further entrenched by a multiculturalism statute by Parliament in 1986. Most Canadians, not all, but most Canadians would say that this concept of multiculturalism is not necessarily incompatible with what we would call integration, or you might call assimilation. That is to say, we all agree across the political spectrum that it's important for people to learn and be proficient in one of our official languages, that it's important for them to have an adequate degree of civic literacy, to understand our history, institutions, cultural norms, and the like. And we apply these expectations in the citizenship program. So when somebody who immigrated to Canada has been a resident for a few years, they go and apply for citizenship like they do in the United States. Like here, they have to take a citizenship test, which I actually significantly upgraded to have a lot more meaningful content, to demonstrate their civic literacy. And they have to be tested on their English language proficiency. They have to demonstrate that they've been a resident in Canada, committed to the country. So there is an expectation that the way I often describe it is I quote former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, who said, there is an obligation on the host society to be a welcoming place, but there's also an obligation on the newcomer to integrate. And we try to keep that two-way street of a welcoming culture, welcoming society that has an expectation that people make an effort at integration. Now, for some people, it's easier than others. If you've come in as a foreign student, studied at a Canadian university, are perfectly proficient in English or French, and you have a Canadian degree that will be recognized by Canadian employers, and you're young and nimble, your path to integration is going to be a lot easier than if you've been a refugee in a camp coming out of a war-torn country and you don't speak English or French. The path to integration is going to be more difficult. For people like that, we provide a fair degree of social support, integration support. I've been to Israel to study their Aliyah centers and how successful they were at welcoming the Ethiopians, for example. So I would say on this question of integration, the Canadian experience has been a measure to success. It's not without challenges. One thing that does concern me is the deepening and the thickening of so-called enclaves of folks from the same country of origin. Now, let me rush to say that is a natural part of immigration patterns anywhere. I mean, you had this all through the history of New York, Little Italy, and the Irish in Hell's Kitchen and Chinatown and so forth. Typically, those communities dissipate over time, gradually through integration / assimilation, and geographically people move out to the burbs. And what concerns me is there may be some evidence, at least in Canada, that's not happening now. And ironically, modern communications technology means you can live in an environment where you're entirely in your mother tongue. That actually, I think, can sometimes retard linguistic integration, right? Which is so there are concerns, there are stress points. When I was the Minister of Immigration, I was dealing with a lot of the commentariat, the opinion elites, who didn't want to discuss those things at all. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think Reihan has been right to raise some of these issues in the debate in the United States, and I think it's helpful to have an honest conversation. When all that stuff gets pushed away, then you end up with, I think, xenophobic movements like we've seen in Europe.
Yes, my name is Michael Myers. I'm the president of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question to you is about Quebecois. Is Quebecois now dead? I remember when, and it's been years since I've been to Canada, but the French were very separatist, and they encouraged all the English-speaking businesses out of Montreal, and so they could focus on French culture, and French science arose everywhere in Montreal and outside of Montreal. So my question to you is Quebecois dead, and is separatism as opposed to assimilation dead? And what about the opposite of that, and that is Canadian acceptance and receptivity of U.S. citizens in terms of who are escaping the Vietnam War and wanting to come to Canada? Is that also dead?
Well, the Canadian draft dodgers are now in their 70s, so you can do the math on that. Exactly. Yeah, well, good point. The Quebecois are alive and well, but Quebec separatism is on life support. There continues to be a separatist party in Quebec provincial politics, but they've seen a huge decline. So roughly from the early 70s until a decade ago, you would typically see support for Quebec separation bouncing around between 40 and 50%. They took it to the polls in two referenda, one in 1980 and one in 1995, and they lost. One case it was 38-62, and the other case was 49-51. That was 2005. That's as close as they got, but they lost by a point and a half. But since then, there's been a gradual decline in energy and support for Quebec separatism, partly because I think that central national government gave more and more autonomy to Quebec, and the younger generation in Quebec really doesn't see the point. They're proud of their Quebec identity, their French language, their history, but I think more and more come to terms with that in a united Canada. Stephen Harper was a Conservative government, very focused on national unity. He adopted a motion in our Parliament recognizing que les Québécois forment une nation au sein d'un Canada uni, that the Quebecers form a nation in the midst of a united Canada. And that's kind of this very creative, ambiguous Canadian formulation that has allowed us to maintain this kind of two nations in one country model.
Thank you. You articulated an incredible vision and with clear values for why you thought about it and how you would get there. It's very unique to us in the United States to hear someone do that so well. How do you intend, or do you intend to communicate that, or to kind of have a campaign for deeper understanding here in the United States of the issues, how we can benefit as Americans?
On which issue? Energy or immigration?
Energy specifically.
Oh, yeah. So our government was elected on a mandate to massively increase our advocacy efforts around responsible resource development. And that's one of the reasons I'm here on this platform and was doing media in New York all day. We'll be setting aside a budget for $30 million as a starter per year to do advertising, social media work, earned media work, to begin to tell our story much more assertively. We have been basically a punching bag for like I said, a coalition of green interest groups funded largely by US foundations because they realized they would have no effect trying to do this in Venezuela, Saudi, Qatar, Iran, Russia. And we're done with that. We are fed up with it. We will no longer be a punching bag for these organizations. We will no longer allow the third largest oil reserves in the world to be defamed when we have the highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards of any major energy producer in the world. So we're moving from a tactical, passive, and defensive posture to an assertive and strategic approach that would be backed up by a multifaceted communications campaign, responding in real time to the lies and myths, and putting the other side on the defense. So we've launched a formal public inquiry under the Inquiries Act into the foreign-funded campaign to landlock our energy. Last year, a U.S. congressional panel, I think the House Energy Committee, if I'm not mistaken, concluded that, by the way, that there was compelling evidence of Russian government activity supporting social media content militating against pipelines and oil and gas development in North America. So we don't think the money's not just coming from the United States. In fact, when I was the Minister of National Defense, the Secretary General of NATO told me point blank that there was no doubt the Russian government was behind funding environmental groups in Europe who are opposing fracking and pipelines there, because of course they want monopoly access to the Central European markets. So we think there is probably a fair bit of mischief going on here, and we are going to push back against it. We're going to use every legal tool at our means to do so. I'll give you an example. This is an analogous example. A Canadian forestry company called Resolute Forest Products was the victim of a decade-long smear campaign by Greenpeace over their responsible forestry practices. And Resolute Forest Products finally said, we've had enough. We're going to hold you accountable for your lies. And they sued Greenpeace for what was, I think, $300 million in US courts under the RICO statute for damages. And Greenpeace had to admit under discoveries that they had purposefully lied about that Canadian company's forestry practices. Now, ultimately, the litigation did not succeed. They didn't get standing, but that's not the point. They forced the other side to lawyer up. They forced them to admit they had lied, and now they forced Greenpeace to think 2 or 3 times before they defame that company again. So I'm encouraging our energy producers to pursue similar legal tactics. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Please join me in thanking Premier Kenney.